Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Elite Dangerous live stream. We have a Discovery Scanner cooked up for you tonight, and I'm about to introduce a man who needs little introduction. I, of course, am Will Flanagan, but that's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about my guest tonight, who is this wonderful man right here. Who are you?
Good evening, my name's Dav. I work on the server team here at Frontier, primarily on the Elite Dangerous project.
So all of the servery witchcraft when things go a little fiery.
Absolutely. The team that works on Elite Dangerous' server team we're responsible for the galaxy simulations, making sure that everybody gets a good experience, making sure that goods are sold, that missions work, to make sure that everybody gets a good experience. Hopefully with minimum disconnections and networking problems, but you know, we monitor the servers, we do what we can. And yeah, we keep an eye on things just to make sure that the galaxy stays ticking along with all of you very many players flying around within it.
So I'm going to pull a little anecdote because it's quite a nice one, I think. When Distant Worlds 2 started this year, and we were all there, you were there, you were logged in, yes, I was logged in.
My little Cobra's out there.
Ready to jump. Everybody jumps and servers go boop. And we were all texting like, Dav, servers are down. Dav's like, I know. Yes,
me and a number of people from the team were definitely online that night. We were keeping a very close eye on the very first mass jump from Distant Worlds 2. For the weeks leading up to it, the team and I brainstormed what we thought might be stressed by a large number of commanders jumping at once. We spent some time engineering certain areas that we thought would maybe be stressed by that. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it didn't go entirely smoothly because of something completely unexpected.
Just another thing.
Yeah, and of course it was fixed for the next week's mass jump.
Yeah.
So we tried the best we can, but players, they just continually surprise us in really great and exciting ways.
And we're going to be talking about that tonight, actually. It's a nice little segue. So tonight's Discovery Scanner is a reprisal of what you did at Lavecon this year, yep. And it's going into a little bit more detail about that. I could ramble on about what this Discovery Scanner is about,
okay.
But I'm going to pass over to you, Dav, because you're now the star of the show.
I thought you were going to do it for me.
I've got the title, Reshaping the Simulation. Right, Dav, so I'm handing over to you. What is this Discovery Scanner all about?
Absolutely. So what we're going to talk about this evening is a recap of the background simulations within the Elite Dangerous Galaxy, and in particular we're going to look at the faction simulation, which is one of the bigger ones, and it is often called the background simulation, but there are a number of them. I'm going to recap a little bit about what the design is, we believe the principles that drive the background simulation are. And also we're going to talk in some detail about the changes that we made last December in Beyond Chapter 4, and some of the changes that we made using server-side changes since then. It might give you an insight into maybe some of the design feedback, some of the ways that we monitor the live galaxy and we iterate upon it. We've talked about this on live streams before now, but this is probably the most detail that we've been into for some of the design processes, with the way that we look at some of the maths and some of the equations. I know you like numbers. Well, we will do what we can to present those in a way that might give some insight. So there are a number of background simulations in Elite Dangerous. The ones that you'll interact with the most often are things like the commodity simulation, which says we've got these starports and these planet bases with some economies. We know what commodities are created and consumed. Economies nearby might import and export different commodities, and players, when they trade in their ships, we will record that and set up trending trade routes for the galaxy map so that players can see what's hot and what's not, maybe identify some trading routes that haven't yet been exploited, and therefore there might be some really good supply and demand to get that good prices. We also have the outfitting simulations. These decide what ships are available in the shipyard or which modules are in stock at that shipyard for that week. Yes, they do vary occasionally based on some situations, and the investment state in particular can enrich what's available through outfitting. I would love to talk a little bit about some of the tricks that we taught the Thargoid simulations in Chapter 4, but this evening we're going to focus on the faction simulation because it's really the biggest topic and it's the one that players interact with most often. It's worth mentioning that one of the key words for here is these are all background simulations. They are designed to bring the galaxy to life based on player activities. They are not necessarily intended to be a end goal in and of themselves. They are supposed to enrich the game using gameplay loops that are a little bit more immediate. These are a little bit more gradual. They work in concert. They work across many different players on many different platforms in all of the different game modes. So they're bringing the Galaxy to life, but they have never been the most visible in terms of their details, although we hoped to correct some of that in Chapter 4 because, well, we'll come on to some of the details in a bit.
So Dav, before we get onto that, we're going to just quickly jump to a back soon screen. There's a little audio issue that we're going to just fix, and so we'll be back in about 2 minutes. So now you know what it's about, think about what's going to come. And we're back, and hopefully you can hear Dav a lot clearer.
Absolutely.
now.
Hopefully we now have sound. I mean, as fun as this would be to do using mime and interpretive dance, I think maybe
Holding
audio.
up signs.
Yeah, no, let's go with audio. Hopefully this is a little bit more
Yeah,
understandable.
you can hear us. If you're not, do let us know. We'll try our best, but we've tweaked where we can, and we don't see an issue on our end, so
no.
Here's hoping. Right.
We haven't yet turned it up as far as 11, but...
We've got megaphones.
Yeah.
Right, so I interrupted you, Dav. I'm so sorry, but ultimately we're looking at the factions of the background sim.
Absolutely. So a quick recap of the faction simulation. So this is the design principles that the faction sim has been implemented in since version 1.0 in 2014. So the idea is that all player actions can have an effect on the shared galaxy. A faction in the game, and there are dozens of thousands of factions across populated space, and there are a lot of populated systems. So a faction represents the interests of the people and the population who are in that star system. They are tied to markets and assets can come in all different shapes and sizes. And as the game has progressed and we've added new content to the game and new gameplay activities to the game, we have added new assets for factions to control. So I've included screenshots of starports, of some of the new space installations, of a planet installation, and a planet port. But the important thing to take home here is that assets can be large, they can be small, they can control the system, or they can control nothing in particular. They might not even be dockable in a ship, but they are still there and performing an economic function for the state of the galaxy. Things like science outposts or industrial installations, they all take part in the economic simulation of the game. And when a faction changes ownership of it, sometimes the decals might change to indicate that the Ownership has changed to a different superpower. Maybe the available ships might change. For instance, the Alliance will have Alliance ships and independents might not. Or, yeah, things like that. But the idea is that that's a way of having politics represented as entities within the game, but that would be less engaging as a galaxy if the factions were static and they just didn't really change over time. So this is where the faction simulation comes into its own. So a faction can have a state. Now a state could be one of different categories. It could be an economic state, or like boom or bust, or there could be famine, or it could be in lockdown. Factions should be able to move between star systems as their fortunes wax and wane. So there's the expansion and the retreat. And finally, when a faction wishes to seek dominance over another, either just politically or maybe wrest control of the starport that controls the star system, then conflicts happen. These could be peaceful, like election, or they could be armed, like war and civil war. So prior to Beyond Chapter 4, only a single state could be active for a given faction, no matter how many star systems that faction is present in. But obviously, if a faction is present in 10 or 20 different star systems, then that's an awful lot of different player inputs that we need to try and represent. So we had a queue, and the queue had priorities. So for example, a bust might be stuck behind a boom, but if a movement state was queued up, if it became eligible for an expansion, then that would take priority over a boom. And yet if a violent conflict came along, then no matter how much the faction might be in an economic boom, if they're fighting with guns and spaceships, then that takes priority over all of the other ones. That was how it was before Chapter 4.
Then we changed it up.
Then we changed it up a bit. So also, as part of the design mechanisms, we designed it around the majority of player activity, which still today is in the smaller ships and for smaller factions. We also received the feedback that conflicts could be difficult to win in some situations. Conflicts are triggered by the influence in a star system, and the influence mechanic was changed to win or lose a war over time, or an election over time. But we received the feedback that was not always the most predictable gameplay activity for people who were trying, as part of their primary gameplay activity, to influence a war. We received the feedback that it wasn't as predictable as perhaps it could be. So we wanted to try and address that. We also heard the feedback that factions were not as straightforward to control when they were in a larger number of star systems. Originally, back when the game released, a faction might be in 2, maybe 5, maybe 10 different star systems. And still today, the vast, vast majority of factions are still only present in their home star system. But over time, through the actions of players, because nothing else drives this, over 4,000 factions are now present in 10 or more star systems. And there are a handful of factions that are in more than 60 different star systems. And we took the view that this was perhaps not scaling as elegantly as players would have come to expect. And likewise, it was time for a change up in the design, and Chapter 4 gave us an opportunity to do that. So we took the opportunity to retune the simulation. So we were looking at the balances of different activities and different states. We took the view that if a faction is present in 40, 50, 60 star systems, then having a single state that represents the fortunes of that many people was perhaps losing some semantics. It was maybe not the most realistic, the most dynamic experience that people would expect from a game that is affecting that many different star systems. Because this is still a game, it must be a realistic simulation, but it also must be enjoyable and be predictable. So we wanted to redesign the simulation so that a faction could be in different states in different star systems, which gave us a great deal of opportunity to redesign a number of things. We also wanted to make it more explicit which states were exclusive of each other and which ones could safely coexist. Previously, we had a queue of states, and these were hidden. This was a server function. It wasn't really displayed in the game client anywhere. So we wanted to make it a little bit more directed, having, say, civil unrest and boom along the same axis. They were both broadly economic, but we felt it would be more clear if we were to split out economic states from security states. So we did. So at Chapter 4, economic states could be in famine, boom, bust, or investment. And we have a concept of an economic points system, which moves up or down along the axis. So we can now represent which activities move the pointer and what states are triggered by that pointer. We added the positive security state of civil liberty, because we only ever had negative security states before, and we felt that if a star system was feeling, well, secure, if you'll pardon the turn of phrase, then we needed a way to represent that in the game. Movement states were largely untouched, with retreat and expansion. Previously, a failed expansion would have directly triggered investment, but we've now moved investment, so it's an explicit, really, really strong economic state. And we're also able to add some rarer states, some ones that occur a little bit less often, just to add a little bit of interest to the game, add a little bit more contrast to the geography. Mm-hmm. So the outbreak state was augmented by the pirate attack state, which could have their own effects and their own triggers and their own consequences within the game. So in addition, at Chapter 4, we added a number of new activity types, a number of core gameplay loops that players can engage in on a minute-to-minute basis. So I've got an illustration here of a megaship that has been damaged by Thargoid attack, and it is asking for players to come and help defend it and also to repair it. Mm-hmm. This is just one example of some of the new activity types that we added at Chapter 4. There's a very large number of installations that the design team and my team helped add to the game. Conflict zones were redesigned. Megaships now had objectives depending on their situation, if they've been broken down or they're under attack by pirates. Mm-hmm. Or perhaps you want to raid it and steal the cargo that's in its cargo bays. All of these new activity types needed to be included into the simulation's design. With these new activity types, we were able to add these to the user interface. So I've got an example here which is showing just the xeno hunting and the exploration activity types. But now that we have that explicitly announced to the players as part of the targets in the navigation panel, we were able to illustrate what actions were possible in a place, and therefore what consequences they might expect from the simulation from engaging within that. We also wanted to bring greater balance to player actions for a given day between the different activity types. We already had the previous activity types. We've added a large number more. So given that we were rebalancing them, we might need to take a more holistic view than simply adding the new activity types and getting on with it. And we also looked at wanting some more design inputs, and I'll definitely come on to how we sorted out the design inputs a little bit later on. However, one of the major pieces of feedback that we heard and we believed ourselves was that the faction simulation can be a little bit opaque. Even today, it is perhaps not as visual and visible as it could be. The problem is that it is a very large amount of data. It is necessarily complicated and affects a large number of player actions. As soon as we display a state in the game, it is instantly out of date as another player has contributed towards it. But with the new economic points, security points, and the political influence system, we were able to add states directly to the user interface. So the right-hand cockpit UI panel is now much more descriptive about what the current state is, maybe what's pending, which direction it's going in, and we're able to include some descriptive text for what it might mean, what some of the consequences might be. We're also able to ride on the tails of the Squadrons feature. Squadrons was an amazing new social feature that we were really excited to bring to the game, but it also gave us an opportunity to change the dimensions to how we were visualizing this. Previously, up until now, the biggest place to get information about the factions was in the local news and Starport services. And we had some diegetic text where you had like a newspaper article saying that a faction is expanding or retreating or the war didn't go so well for them. But if we're adding multiple states in multiple systems, that very quickly fell down, especially given that the user interface panel for that is about yay big. So we were able to bring together a user interface pane which brings out the detail for every single star system that faction is in. The limiting factor here is that we can only display one faction at once, which is why the squadron feature let us engage with that by tagging a squadron to a faction, which was then the selection for which faction of the dozens of thousands we displayed. So these were ways that we could bring out the state. I mean, we've just made the state a lot more complicated because you've got different states in different star systems. We needed a way to bring this out from the game, otherwise it would be less meaningful for players. We also took the opportunity to use the objective system that we brought to Chapter 4 to rebuild how conflict zones work. So previously, conflict zones were relatively undynamic affairs where we spawned two populations of NPCs from two factions. They were hostile to each other, players joined in, and they received combat bonds for participating. With the objective-based system, we're able to bring something a little bit more guided. In particular, we're able to bring some optional objectives, and it also meant that a given instance of a conflict zone could suddenly have an outcome, as opposed to it just being an ongoing representation of factions in armed conflict. A battle could be won or lost, but the war might still be ongoing. So this was one of the biggest things that we were able to bring to this. So we have objectives and we have optional objectives. In addition to this, we were able to spend some time developing the technology for how we spawn, how we place scenarios within space. And we were able to bring a political element to where we placed conflict zones within the game that previously was mostly geographic in nature. So, for instance, if a faction's asset was at risk, we were able to spawn conflict zones closer to that asset, as opposed to being around an asteroid base, maybe 3 or 4 planets away. We wanted conflicts to have fixed durations so that it was a little bit clearer for what to expect and when, but also so that players who could maybe only play at certain times of the week still had an opportunity to contribute towards their faction. And as I mentioned previously, faction conflicts used to be based on the influence mechanic, and whilst today they are still triggered by influence, we have now given them their own scoring mechanism. So at Chapter 4, we now have the concept of a day. So if a conflict lasts for 5 days, at the end of any given day, using the same tick that we use to advance the rest of the simulation, we tally up who got how many plus points, who else got how many plus points, and we declare a winner. So it was a race to the top. And then whoever won that day got a point in the 1 days. Whoever won the most number of days, that's easy for me to say, won the conflict. In addition, there was some uncertainty from players. This was one of the things that we looked at quite a bit, was players who won a conflict were often surprised by the outcome. They might have been expecting to get a large Coriolis starport, but instead their faction took control over a undockable planet installation, and this was maybe surprising to them. So we were able to declare at the start of the conflict what they were fighting over, which meant that we could bring it out in the user interface and the news reports as well. Just makes it a little bit more visible for what's going on. The conflict scoring mechanism is still fundamentally based on the same actions that it was previously. So elections are non-combat actions only. So anything that will boost the economic status of a faction will go towards contributing towards its election score. Likewise, if it's in a war or a civil war, then only combat actions will contribute towards it. And yes, the new conflict zone objectives are one of the stronger ways of doing it. Combat bonds are not quite as strong, but they contribute towards it to a certain extent. But also the mission system do, violent crimes do, assassinating other NPCs. But selling exploration data doesn't help a faction if they're busy fighting for their very presence in that system.
Which kind of makes sense to me.
Yes.
From a glance. If anybody is just joining us midway through, and Dav is reading off all of this interesting information about factions and the background simulation, this stream in particular is a discovery scanner where we take an opportunity to look behind the curtain at sort of what goes into developing Elite Dangerous. And tonight we're discussing factions and the background simulation, as you may have guessed.
Absolutely. So this is where the technical part begins. We've reviewed some of the design concepts. This should hopefully give you an indication of the objectives that we are trying to achieve. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implementation details. This is where some of the database work comes in. There may even be some mild statistics ahead, so please do be warned. So the illustration that we have on the screen at the moment is the style of the database structure that we used prior to Chapter 4. So for a given faction, which was cleared down during the daily tick, we stored the sum total of player actions, but they were converted in units to do with the state that that action affected. So this was very much a real-time simulation in terms of monitoring player activity, player transactions, player actions. So at the time the action happened, we would categorize it. We would transform it from saying this is a murder, this is a mission completing, this is some exploration data. And then we would take a look at what states were active at that time. And then we would convert that into this might increase their influence or this might contribute towards lockdown. And then we would add that to these buckets, let's call them, inside the database. And these were tallied up over the day. And then at the end of the day, or the start of the next day, every 24 hours or so, for those who like to track the tick, these were tallied, and then we would look at what the overall efforts were for the last 24 hours, and that would form the new situation. Now, that wasn't going to accurately record the player activities now that we've suddenly added a certain amount of complexity. We have multiple states where previously there was just one. States could be different between different star systems where before they were not. And in particular, we wanted to look at how we can better balance different activities between each other from a design point of view. We wanted to take more of an aggregated approach over the day for how much players have affected a certain faction, as opposed to trying our best to do it in a real-time situation. So this much more complicated database structure, and again, this is only indicative. This is not exactly a screenshot from the live Mongo cluster of every faction for every day. We now store a number of metrics. We've mentioned economic points, security points, and influence. We wanted to be able to better balance positive actions against negative actions, as opposed to it being a tug of war that could very quickly become undone. For example, exploration data is an extremely highly scored number just because of the value of credits involved, whereas smuggling is often done in small ships, which means you have a number of relatively small transactions. So we wanted a way to better balance those. We also needed to record which star system that effect was happening within, and missions, they can affect more than one star system for a single mission because it can start and end in different places. And we wanted to be able to better balance different activity types against each other. So for example, if we look at the example on screen, ignore the actual numbers, but the units where we put the decimal point is important. So for example, mission over a day might be a plus 16, exploration data over the day might be plus 300,000. If people have been doing some of the core mining that was included in Chapter 4, that plus could be tens of millions. Those are obviously very different orders of magnitude to try and balance against each other. So we wanted to have some more design controls about that. One of the other questions that frequently comes up is exactly which action affects which state. So this lovely wall of text that I've just put in front of you, and I'm sure is being thoroughly screenshotted, is an illustration of, at Chapter 4, which actions affect which of those dimensions. It doesn't necessarily directly affect the state, but it tells you how we have intended, for instance, trade versus smuggling, to have an effect on the economic welfare of a faction. Don't worry too much about the details here, because the core data structures that I paraphrased this from are several hundred lines long. There's a lot of detail in there. There's a lot of design coefficients. There's a lot of different functions and algorithms involved. But in general terms, if you do a positive thing to a faction, positive things should happen to it. If you do a negative thing to a faction, bad things will happen to it, or perhaps you're reining in some of the positive actions that are happening to it. It's difficult to summarize some of the details because, again, they are in very different orders of magnitude. But, for example, a typical scenario worth of combat bonds might be worth, say, 20 or 30% of a medium conflict zone, but a high-intensity conflict zone might be worth more than that, simply because it is either harder to achieve, or it takes longer to achieve, or it takes the same amount of time, but a player must have spent more time progressing their ship's power, and therefore we need to recognise that progression as well, so that whilst the Galaxy simulation must and does respond to every new player in their Sidewinder, we needed a way of quantifying people's progressions if they're in, say, an engineered Fer-de-Lance. which takes a much greater investment in terms of time and progression and player skill as well. So missions and scenarios are just too varied to include on the table. If I did, it would still be scrolling for whilst I've been talking about it. There's just too many variations. But needless to say, this is roughly how we deal with this. However, this is just which inputs we would like to hook up to which outputs. How do we convert between those activity units and those state units? Because if you remember, at chapter 4, we are now storing numbers in the database in units of the activity type from the player, not the faction state that it's affecting. And this is where the maths begins. So one of the things that we wanted to try and do to make sure that we didn't introduce unexpected change during the design process for chapter 4 was to base our design exercise on what the inputs and outputs were achieving today. The inner workings were changing significantly. You saw the different design dimensions in the database, but we needed to make sure that the net change was as small as we could possibly manage it. That way we could trust that the implementation of the new states and the new dimensions was broadly correct from a strictly science point of view. The type of curve that I've illustrated there, it is a straightforward logarithmic progression, and it illustrates along two axes. We have a fictional state axis and a fictional activity axis, and it shows you one way of illustrating how we can convert from one into another. Now, many activity types are by their very nature logarithmic in their progression. As a player power expands, or as many players over the course of a day contribute towards one action. For example, if somebody has just done 10 courier missions, or somebody has found a lucrative trade route and they are quickly running backwards and forwards until somebody else finds it, or the supply and demand is exhausted, then each of those is a relatively linear progression. Whereas if you're trading in, say, a Sidewinder, you might have 5 or 10 units of cargo. If you're doing it in a Type 6, you might have, say, 80 or 90. If you're trading in a Type 9, you might be up as many as 600 or 700 units of cargo. Each of those is a logarithmic progression, which means that when you take that into consideration, our inputs against outputs, our activities versus states, is actually a relatively linear progression. And that way it leads to relatively easy to understand design constraints, because we need to be confident that what we want to happen is relatively close to what actually happens. There is some uncertainty because no matter how hard we design the game, how rigorously we try and train it and validate the models based on player activity, there will always be some player actions that surprise us, that are creative, that touch the simulation in ways that it doesn't behave particularly elegantly. And we'll come on to that in a little bit later on. But in order to redesign this, we looked at the live game, because one of the luxuries that we have from a design point of view is we can take an anonymized section of time from the live game server's transaction logs, and we can take, say, a 4-week chunk. We can anonymize it to make sure that we don't risk any personally identifiable information leaking. We can then aggregate it per faction, per system, per day, which are the new units of measurement, and then we can quantify them. So, for example, the histogram that's being shown here is an opinion in activity units. So this is the outputs of the simulation of the influence gained from trade sell. So along the y-axis, that is the count for that population sample. So we can see that the majority of days, most factions had relatively little influence gained from trade sell, but some days there was a very, very, very large amount of influence gained from trade sell. And again, it doesn't look particularly interesting, it's just diminishing return, but if we go and apply logarithmic function, we suddenly have these very clear quantifiers of sections within it. So this gives us a concrete mathematical goal to aim for when we are measuring the results of our newly designed simulation. So this is what the results want to be, but one of the things that we need to model is what all the different possible inputs might be. And again, we can use the same data set to do that. So what we have here is a histogram, which I've overlaid with an approximation of the distribution of that, thanks Octave and its histfit function. So these are populations, again summed per faction, per star system, per day, And again, I've used trade sell as an example here. So we can see that, again, by and large, most transactions are round about, say, 0 to 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4. And this is because the vast majority of trading is either small ships, or it is people selling salvage, or just relatively unconcerted efforts, as opposed to getting a cutter, filling it with cargo bays and shuttle running. That's relatively uncommon, but it does happen, and we must recognise that. And this also gives us an indication of what the majority of typical faction inputs are likely to be per faction, per system, per day. And to that goal, I've used 2 sigma, which is a way of quantifying. This is the majority of typical of likely inputs, which we need to put as being where the most variety in outputs comes in. We must still recognise very small and very large outputs, but the majority of them fit within this bell curve. And this is where we were designing for it. In statistical terms, you might say this is overfitting, but because we had very specific design objectives in mind, this was actually a desirable outcome. But we still have to make sure that the design allows for every single possible player activity. So this is one of the examples of the outputs. So obviously it doesn't make a huge amount of sense, and you'll forgive me for not running this through a logarithmic x-axis, because it's possible to make an economic loss when you're doing commodity trading. I'm afraid I couldn't put a log scale on it, because you can't do a log of negative numbers without getting into imaginary numbers, and nobody wants imaginary numbers in the galaxy. It's complicated enough, thank you very much. However, what it does illustrate is the majority of the active area. So we can see that the response between, say, in this case, minus 25 and plus 25 has been fitted to the majority of those player inputs. And we then went through this process and validated it for each of the different activity types that we have within the game. And then this was where we got to for Chapter 4. Then it released in early December. And then very quickly, we were monitoring the live game. We were taking the live transaction logs, again, through the same anonymizing and aggregation process. And we then checked the results. Was the live simulation behaving in the way that we designed it to? And some things were perhaps not quite as respectful of what we were trying to achieve as we were aiming for. So very, very quickly, I think it was within the first week, exploration data and missions were both very quickly tweaked. They had different orders of magnitude out. In addition, the new activity types, because we didn't have a realistic model of typical player inputs, we weren't sure exactly how players were going to engage with the new activities. We just did the best we could, and then we watched it. So it was very quickly apparent that the rate of change of influence for that first week was too high. Factions were gaining and losing 10, 15, maybe even 20% of influence a day. That rate of change was just too rapid for players to have a reasonable control over it. So we reined in some of the daily caps. This calmed things down and gave us the opportunity to reconsider things from a design point of view. And this is where we started in the new year. This was back in January 2019. So as opposed to using a logarithmic progression like we saw before, we decided to evaluate a different style of equation. So what we have here is an extremely rudimentary one. This was drawn with a ruler, but it gave us a very quick way of iterating on some design ideas for how we could transpose activity units into state units for the mission system. And I've already mentioned the mission system is extremely varied, therefore the responses from it can be extremely varied. So what we have here is an illustration of the type of curves that we were looking at, and it gives us an idea about the design constraints that we were trying to, design controls that we were trying to express. So we still have the concept of an early ramp up, respecting every single action. We still have the concept of the diminishing returns, maintaining a reasonable response for potentially very, very, very large inputs. But the majority, and I do mean the vast majority, is in this active phase where we have the most contrast between different typical inputs. Also, very quickly, we received feedback from players that they were finding it difficult to move influence for factions. now that factions could have multiple states in multiple systems, previously where there was a single conflict allowed active and other systems that were not caught by the conflict, conflicts were now blocking movement in all systems. And this was proving too cumbersome for players to try and affect and direct, especially when factions are in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 star systems. So we took the opportunity to slightly tweak how we were allocating influence and also how we were rebalancing influence up to 100%, because whilst most of the dimensions and most of the effects are independent, one faction's economic points is unrelated to another faction's economic points, the influence within a system is always close to sum. It must add up to 100%. We also modified how we were scoring conflicts a little bit, and this was some of the major design changes that we iterated upon after receiving player feedback and monitoring how the galaxy really responded. So we discovered that conflicts, well, not discovered, we decided that conflicts that did not have something at stake were no longer as interesting as ones that had. So in order to let factions move up beyond each other, because some systems might have 6 or maybe even 7 factions in them, that we would only start a conflict if one or the other or both of the factions had an asset at risk. We also had the concept of bonus days at the release of Chapter 4. So the design idea behind that is if a faction was losing 4 days down to 0, that through heroic effort on those remaining 3 days, they might still force a draw. The feedback that we received from the players was that this was too opaque, maybe a little bit too surprising. So instead, we removed the function of bonus days, but instead, if it was no longer possible for a faction to win that war, then we would simply end the war earlier, which means that wars can suddenly end after 4 days rather than going the full duration. And this may seem like a small thing, but when factions are in conflict, because if you imagine we've got 2 faction influences moving around in a system, a conflict is triggered when they get close to each other in influence, and then they lock together for the duration of the conflict. When those are locked together, their influence cannot change, which means that the other systems in the factions in the system have less influence to move within, because these 2 must remain locked together. We then unlocked that for the day when they're recovering from the conflict, which just, when taken in aggregation over the game, actually freed up the influence simulation by quite a lot. We also received good feedback from our missions change for how we were equating the activities into the states. So we took the design decision that all of the activity types would really benefit from this style of design control as opposed to the previous shape of equations. We also had a number of times when the galaxy did perhaps not elegantly respond to certain situations, such as when the Distant Worlds 2 expedition visited Explorer's Anchorage for the mining community goal. The player activities for there were, I would say, unprecedented with some confidence. The amount of exploration data that was sold to Explorer's Anchorage was, I would say, very, very high. But in addition, there were a number of other players who were supporting the other factions in that system with a very large number of credit donation missions. And again, the number of those being completed was of an unprecedented level. And the Galaxy just didn't give us an elegant response for how they were coping. It tried its best, but it wasn't giving us the result that we were looking for. So we redesigned all of our activities, and this was a complete redesign from those same mathematical models for how all of the activities were balanced from activities into states. So what I've illustrated now is a logistic curve. This is an S-curve. This is a smooth response for how inputs and outputs are equated together. You can see it's broadly similar to that approximation that I drew with a ruler a few slides ago, but it gave us a more continuous response. It has infinite bounds. I mean, it can go below 0 if you really want it to, although I wouldn't recommend it, which is one of the reasons why we have tallied up the negative inputs separately from the positive inputs. It means that we can use the same design functions and then balance them against each other during the tick, as opposed to it being a real-time function. This gave us much greater design control. It also meant that we'd doubled the number of activities that we needed to have equations for, because some went up as well as some went down. So we used the design tool and we placed the inputs, if you can remember that histogram I drew earlier on, such that that same 2 sigma worth of inputs were now placed into the majority of the contrast from the outputs. So this was the modelling part of the exercise. So we trained some models, we looked at the design coefficients, and then we monitored it. And we found it gave us a good result. So as part of some of the server-side updates that we made without interrupting the service to the Galaxy, this was played out in the early months of 2019. And now this is how the majority of activity types are scored today. There are a few that are not using this. Complex scores is another good example of something that's a more real-time function. But anything that is tallied for the day is now using an equation such as this. And we found that this gave us very elegant responses, even for unreasonably strong or unreasonably small inputs. And that is the secrets of how we redesigned the faction simulation for beyond Chapter 4.
Dav, thank you so much. I won't claim to be an expert of the BGS, and when we started to talk about graphs, I was like, yes, I'm following, I think. No, wait.
Yeah.
No, I'm. But I know there are people out there who are really interested in this stuff. There are a lot of BGS experts here who are furiously probably rewinding or waiting to rewind. This video will be available to go and pore over these details. But yes, we have a Dav here, so it seems fitting that we have a little bit of a Q&A.
Indeed.
You collected some of the questions.
I did. I'm afraid I wasn't able to keep track of questions that were raised during the stream on the chat channel. I'm afraid I couldn't read that quickly. It was especially not whilst presenting to camera. But I have noted a few questions already that I can maybe address from the forum threads, and if somebody can shout out some other ones from the chat, then we can maybe look at this. So one of the very first questions that we received a lot is, how are factions that were placed in the game from the request of player groups different to the NPC factions that we designed? And the short answer is they are absolutely identical in every possible regard, except maybe we answer more questions on the player factions than we do on the NPC ones. There is absolutely no other regard. The game doesn't even know there is a difference. They are just the same. Let's see, what else did we have trends for? Many people asked about why, say, negative states were difficult to achieve, why retreat was maybe difficult to sustain, how faction system happiness could maybe engage with movement states such as expansion. I want to touch on that a little bit because this was another opportunity that Squadrons brought to us. We needed a way of supporting how successful a faction was being rather than just its size, because it is arguably more difficult to control a larger faction, but if you have a larger group of players, then perhaps you've got more options. So this is where the happiness mechanic was introduced in Chapter 4. And at the moment it is being used to contribute towards the political leaderboard for a given faction. A happy faction is going to give you a better position on the leaderboard than an unhappy faction. You can still do it with an unhappy faction, it just takes more effort and it's harder to achieve. People also mentioned that factions with high influence can sometimes get stuck in a chain expansion. If a faction is at a high influence in a system and it's uncontended, then it can get stuck in that direction. Mm-hmm. And we've also heard that players would maybe prefer missions to have a greater impact for a given investment in time and progression. So some of those were design constraints that we designed into the system, in particular how actions were balanced against each other. But a lot of these things that I've just reeled off, and these were asked by a large number of commanders, so apologies for not name checking each of you. These are all things that we've talked about internally, we've heard the feedback, and we would like to consider in a future update. However, whilst we are actively talking about them at the moment, we have nothing to announce today about it. But it is under active consideration if we can maybe fit it into another update in the future. Mm-hmm. So on the forums, Commander Rubber Nuke, name check, mentioned that earlier on during the background sim, he'd seen they had seen conflict zones pop up in asteroid belts, and they've not seen one in the live build ever again. Can conflict zones appear anywhere? So I mentioned briefly in passing how the Galaxy simulation in Chapter 4 now knew about the political landscape of a star system as well as the geographic one. I took a look at the design preferences for where we're placing conflict zones, and as well as spawning closer to faction assets, each of the low, medium and high conflict zones have their own sets of primary and backup preferences for where they're trying to spawn. Today, they will try very, very hard indeed to spawn in a ring system around a star, but it is possible, although very, very unlikely, that they'll spawn around a planet ring. There are a number of reasons for that, some technical. You may have seen some frame of reference bugs shortly after Chapter 4 that we've since fixed. But we agree that it would lead to some cool flying experiences, but for the moment it is unlikely that a conflict zone will spawn around a planet ring. We'll never say never, but no changes to announce today. Commander Samurai 83 ITA asked, when you leave a conflict zone, how does this count for the day's war? So at the moment, it doesn't. A conflict zone, even though it won't have any ships in it, is there for everybody on all platforms for that system for that day. So the objectives count towards it, so a win will count, a loss will count, but if it's left to its own devices, then only the player activities will count towards it. So if you collected some combat bonds whilst you're in there, but perhaps you had to leave before the objective was completed, then we'll still recognise those combat bonds when they're redeemed. But without the objective, no score. Commander Missani event, apologies for mangling your name there, mentioned that static capital ship installations are based upon the default owner of a system and they don't seem to transfer ownership. The answer to that is yes, that is indeed the case. Capital ship installations don't change ownership. If a Federal star system contains a capital ship that is building Farragut class capital ships, it would make little sense for an Empire faction to control that. Mm-hmm. That's not something that the simulation is able to influence today. We can't despawn the Farraguts and spawn some interdictors, for example. That's not something that we have. So yes, for the moment, those aren't considered assets from the point of view of the faction simulation, but all of the other installations that you'll see around the galaxy are. At least anything that has a jurisdiction around it.
Great, thank you, Dav. Those were some of the questions that we gathered from the forums. We'll try our best to answer some right here, but if there isn't anything we get to today, and of course we can't answer everything, but we will do a follow-up. We'll try to do a follow-up next week.
Absolutely. First question we have here from Nick Bolts. Any hopes that population numbers in a star system will vary? So at the moment, the answer is no. It's obviously a cool idea. It could lead to some spectacular gameplay, but it's not something that we are talking about implementing in the game today. Just because it has a great deal of design complexity. You can see where the design might lead, but speculating on design might have had. Ideas are never the hard part. Trying to build them into a cohesive whole and then schedule time to implement them, that's what we're trying to work within.
Are there any more questions? I know there's some scrolled up. Chat is moving quite quickly, so if you do have more questions, do pop them in. We'll try our best to answer them. We're here for another five-ish minutes, so if there are...
Are we going to track and remove inactive player minor factions? The problem with that is, how do you quantify inactive? Could it be that the players simply haven't touched them for a time? So one of the design constructs within the game is that a faction can never die. It is always present in its home system, even if it has no influence. And that's the same for player-sponsored factions as well as the other factions. Whilst we have a very large number of player minor factions in the game, they are still vastly dwarfed by the number of NPC factions. We are talking dozens of thousands of NPC factions. So there are a number of questions about negative states. Yes, we hear the feedback that you would like negative states easier to influence. We hear that feedback. It's something we're talking about. I'm afraid there's nothing to announce today about how we might achieve that, what design we might change to make that easier.
It's not something you can just decide here and now.
No, I would like to, but then I would be lying because production and design would say no. And that's entirely reasonable because I'm just an implementer and my team are just an implementer.
Is there anything else here that we can grab?
Expansion tax. Yes, we hear the feedback. It's something we've heard on a number of occasions. It's something we're actively considering. Somebody mentioned briefly how Thargoid conflict zones spawn. Yes, that's part of some of the Thargoid simulations that happened within Chapter 4. I'd love to go into the detail now, but then we'd have to have another hour's live stream, and I don't think anybody's prepared for that this evening.
I'll have to try and get you back for another for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, people asking about future features such as fleet carriers. We are going to be talking about them in the future, I'm sure.
Yes.
that time is not today.
Not today. It's not this kind of live stream. We're gonna be going all into the details, as Dav rightly says. But yeah, today we're talking about factions and the background simulation and anything that weaves those two together.
Indeed. So okay. So retreat, famine. Yes, we hear the feedback. Nothing to announce today.
The negative states.
Somebody mentioned briefly in passing, if a criminal faction has control of a black market, does that aid or hinder them? So the way that that's represented in the Galaxy simulation, this is actually part of the economic simulation, not part of the faction's political simulation. So when a criminal faction takes over control of a market, which goods or which commodities they deem illegal changes. So whilst a social faction might deem trading in weapons to be illegal and therefore smuggling them on the black market harms their economic interests, when a criminal faction takes over, that is no longer illegal, and therefore you can no longer smuggle them on the black market. Instead, selling them on the open market becomes a net positive impact. That's how it's modelled. Anything that is smuggled on the black market, by its very nature, is something which they've deemed illegal, and that's always for a negative effect. Any
more there, Dav? I mean,
yes.
I'm
absolutely
your behest for this one.
Indeed. So I would love to talk about missions, but the mission system it's very dynamic. It has, I think at last count, 110, 120 different mission templates to choose between. Each template can have a number of different variables that are generated based on the market in that system with those factions at that time for nearby factions. The number of variables are high. So trying to quantify those on the live stream for you would maybe take, again, all evening. Likewise, people who are asking about general networking questions. So, for instance, the game has a debugging mechanic for bookmarking a network crash. If somebody has taken the time to do that and has logged a support ticket, and that makes its way through to us as a bug report that we have investigated, looking at those network bookmarks is incredibly helpful because it gives us a snapshot of the peer-to-peer matchmaking network connections for that group of players. It is not something that we draw attention to in and of itself because it only has to work within the context of a wider bug report. Having it there is invaluable, and we're grateful to those players who use it, but it in and of itself is not something that will attract our attention to it because it's too prevalent, and also it doesn't give us a context of whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, or somebody misclicked on the keyboard.
Okay, Dav, I think that's really all we have time for today.
One final question. Are bounties and bonds on the same S-curve? If it's affecting the security state, yes it is. If it's affecting a conflict state, no it isn't.
Do you want to answer another one, Dav?
No, I'm done.
You don't? You sure?
Yeah.
Because I want to take it away from you.
Over to you.
Well, that wasn't a veiled threat. I mean it. I promise. Thank you, Dav, for joining us tonight. Thank you to everybody in the chat who came along. This is a reprise of what Dav went into at Lavecon this year.
Damn it, there's another question I wanted to answer.
You can answer it. I'm not going to deny the community.
One final question. I promise I'm done after this. Will do his best to give a closing report. So one of the comments that's just scrolled past was somebody asking about markets that are in different positions within a star system. And this was something that we added to the economic simulation in Chapter 4. So where previously the prices of a good is affected by the supply and demand, what we were able to do was reflect the distance you had to fly in supercruise from where you entered the star system into that equation. The logic being that any players, either an NPC or a player, who doesn't have to travel very far, might not get such a good response from the market as somebody who's just flown to Hutton Orbital. And therefore, Hutton Orbital will, by its nature, naturally have better prices, both because they have to pay a premium because they're more inaccessible, and also because fewer players make that journey, and therefore there is a greater amount of supply or a greater amount of demand, and therefore the price is naturally higher. This was a change. It's not political, it's more economic in nature, but it was something that we changed in Chapter 4.
There you go.
Promise I'm done now.
We're going to have to close up because otherwise Stephen over there might yank Dav off with one of those old-fashioned hooks.
Yeah, and nobody wants to see me exiting stage left.
Right, I'm going to bring it back round. Thank you, Dav. Really, thank you for going into detail about that again. It's It's quite a long monologue there. I mean, I nodded as best I could, but there you go. And thank you to everyone again who dropped by. So that's all we have time for. That has been our 6th Discovery Scanner, I think, and we'll be revisiting or visiting more Discovery Scanners in the future. Dav will likely show his lovely face on the stream again. I have no doubt of that. And as I said, if there are any questions that you have that aren't on the forums, we are going to try and get to as many as we can. So yeah, pop on the chat. Yep. And thanks again. We're going to be signing out right now. So see you next time. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.